I need a mother for my pups and you need protection, the Alpha proposed to the poor Omega healer when enemy wolves kidnapped his pack members and demanded the woman he'd grown to love in exchange. Alpha King Ricardo faced an impossible choice. Save his people or protect the only person who could heal his shattered heart. Can Ricardo find a way to save everyone, or will love force him to make the ultimate sacrifice? Chapter 1. The Weight of Graves. Alpha King Ricardo Blackwood stood motionless before Elena's grave, winter wind cutting through his dark cloak like the memories that haunted him. Snow gathered on the carved stone that bore his first mate's name, each flake a reminder of how quickly warmth could be extinguished. 3 months had passed since childbirth claimed her life, leaving him with twin pups and a heart frozen solid as the ground beneath his feet. Behind him, Ravenclaw Castle rose like a granite monument to his failures. Within those walls, his sons cried endlessly for a mother who would never return, their wails echoing through corridors that once rang with Elena's laughter. Every caretaker he'd hired had fled within days, unable to handle the grief-stricken pups who rejected anyone who wasn't their lost mother. "Love makes you weak," he whispered to the headstone, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Elena had been his vulnerability, and her death proved that caring deeply only led to devastating loss. The rival packs circling his territory like vultures understood this truth. They waited for him to show weakness, to let emotion compromise his judgment. His beta Marcus approached through the snow, his weathered face grim with news. "Your Majesty, the latest nanny has fled. She said the pups are impossible." The words struck Ricardo like physical blows. His children needed care, but every solution seemed to slip through his fingers like winter mist. Ricardo's jaw tightened as he turned from the grave, his amber eyes hard as frozen stone. "Then find someone desperate enough to try," he commanded, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. How could he protect his pack when he couldn't even comfort his own children? The wind howled through the cemetery, carrying the promise of harsher storms ahead. In the distance, wolves called to each other across the frozen landscape, their voices speaking of survival and strength. Ricardo pulled his cloak tighter, steeling himself for another night of listening to his pups cry for comfort he couldn't provide. Love had already cost him everything once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Chapter 2. The Sound of Suffering. Within the stone walls of Ravenclaw Castle, Ricardo's study offered no refuge from the sound that haunted his every waking moment, his twin sons' inconsolable crying. The noise drifted through the ancient fortress like a physical presence, disrupting council meetings and making concentration impossible. At 6 months old, little Antonio and Gabriel possessed lungs that could summon wolves from miles away, yet no amount of crying brought back the mother they instinctively sought. Ricardo forced himself to focus on the reports spread across his massive oak desk, each document detailing threats to his territory that demanded immediate attention. 3 rival packs had increased their border patrols, testing his defenses while he struggled with domestic chaos. The Iron Fang pack particularly concerned him. Their alpha had been making inquiries about Ricardo's weakened state following Elena's death. "Your Majesty," Marcus entered without ceremony, his expression reflecting the exhaustion that plagued the entire castle. "The council awaits your decisions on the southern border defenses, but—" He paused as another wail echoed through the halls. "Perhaps we should postpone until—" "No." Ricardo's voice cut through the air like a blade. "My personal struggles do not supersede pack security." But even as he spoke, his concentration shattered as Antonio's cry escalated to a heartbreaking shriek. The sound reminded him too vividly of Elena's final moments when she'd begged him to protect their children. He rose abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked his territory. Below, pack members moved with purpose through the courtyard, but he could see the uncertainty in their postures. A leader whose own children rejected him appeared weak, vulnerable to challenge. In the werewolf world, perceived weakness invited conquest. Send scouts to find any available caretakers, he commanded without turning around. Cast the net wider, look beyond our territory if necessary. His reflection in the glass showed a man aged beyond his 31 years, golden eyes dulled by grief and sleepless nights. Marcus hesitated. Sire, we've already exhausted most options. Few women are willing to. Another piercing cry interrupted him, and Ricardo's hands clenched into fists. He needed a solution before his enemies realized just how thoroughly his personal losses had compromised his ability to lead. Chapter 3: Desperate Measures. Ricardo stood in the castle's great hall, addressing a gathering of his most trusted pack members. The massive stone chamber, with its soaring arches and ancient tapestries depicting wolf hunts, had witnessed countless important decisions throughout the generations. Today, it would witness perhaps his most desperate one. "I need options," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Around the room, faces reflected the same exhaustion that plagued him. His children's constant crying had affected the entire castle, fraying nerves and disrupting the natural order that kept a pack strong. Beta Marcus cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, we've received word of a healer in the eastern woods. An Omega who's been living rough for several weeks." He paused, reading Ricardo's expression. She might be desperate enough to accept challenging circumstances. Ricardo's attention sharpened. Omega wolves possessed natural nurturing instincts that made them excellent caretakers, but they were also rare and highly sought after. An Omega living alone in winter woods suggested either extraordinary circumstances or a woman with nowhere else to turn. "What do we know about her?" Ricardo asked, though part of him wondered if desperation was making him consider increasingly poor options. An unknown Omega with mysterious circumstances hardly seemed like the ideal solution to his problems. "Very little," Marcus admitted. "The scouts report she's been seen tending to injured animals, which suggests healing abilities. She appears to be alone, without pack protection." The implications hung heavy in the air. A lone Omega in winter was either extremely resourceful or running out of time. From the upper levels of the castle, the twins' cries resumed with renewed intensity. Several pack members exchanged worried glances, and Ricardo felt his authority diminishing with each wail. He needed to act before his weakness became impossible to ignore. "Prepare a small party," he decided, surprising himself with the swiftness of his decision. "We'll investigate this healer personally." The words felt like admitting defeat, but sometimes survival required swallowing pride. Marcus nodded, though his expression suggested reservations about their Alpha personally pursuing such a desperate measure. "Shall I organize a full guard escort?" "No." Ricardo's amber eyes glinted with determination. "This requires discretion, not force." He would meet this mysterious Omega himself and perhaps find the solution that had eluded him for months. Chapter 4: Into the Wild. The winter forest stretched endlessly before Ricardo as he rode through snow-laden trees, accompanied only by Marcus and two trusted scouts. The decision to venture personally into the wilderness felt both reckless and necessary. He needed to assess this mysterious Omega healer himself, rather than rely on second-hand reports that might prove disappointingly inaccurate. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they followed barely visible tracks through the underbrush. The forest felt alive with hidden dangers, from rival pack scouts to desperate rogues who might view a small traveling party as an opportunity. Yet something about this mission felt different from his usual calculated strategies, perhaps because desperation had made him willing to consider options he would normally dismiss. The tracks lead toward the old healing springs, Marcus observed, his experienced eyes reading signs invisible to most. Legend says they hold special properties for Omega wolves. His voice carried skepticism about such folklore, but Ricardo found himself hoping there might be truth in the old stories. They crested a small hill, and Ricardo's acute senses detected something that made him raise his hand to halt the party. Below, in a small clearing beside a partially frozen stream, a figure knelt in the snow. Even from a distance, he could see her gentle movements as she tended to what appeared to be an injured deer. The sight struck him unexpectedly. Elena had possessed that same instinctive care for wounded creatures, that immediate compassion that seemed to flow as naturally as breathing. He'd forgotten what such selfless kindness looked like, having surrounded himself with warriors and strategists who valued strength over gentleness. "That must be her," Marcus whispered, but Ricardo barely heard him. He watched, mesmerized, as the woman worked with patient skill to bandage the deer's injured leg. Her auburn hair caught the weak winter sunlight, and her movements held a grace that spoke of inherent nurturing abilities. When she released the deer and it bounded away on steadier legs, Ricardo felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought permanently frozen. This woman possessed exactly the kind of healing touch his children needed, but could someone so gentle survive in his harsh world? As if sensing observation, she looked up directly at their hiding place, her green eyes meeting his across the distance with startling directness. Chapter 5: First Contact. Isabella Ashwood's heart hammered against her ribs as four mounted figures emerged from the tree-line, their dark cloaks marking them as something far more dangerous than common travelers. The largest rider commanded attention effortlessly, broad shoulders, sharp amber eyes, and an aura of authority that made her instinctively step back despite the stream blocking easy retreat. She recognized the signs immediately: Alpha Wolf. His scent carried power and something darker, a grief so profound it seemed to permeate the winter air around him. Behind him, 3 other wolves flanked him protectively, their hands resting casually on weapon hilts in a way that suggested long practice with violence. "You're the healer," the Alpha said, his voice carrying across the clearing with quiet command. It wasn't a question. Isabella's bare survival in these woods for 3 weeks had apparently earned her a reputation, though she couldn't decide if that was fortunate or terrifying. "I try to help where I can," she replied carefully, studying his face for signs of his intentions. Lone alphas seeking Omega healers rarely had purely benevolent motives, but desperation had taught her to assess threats quickly and accurately. He dismounted with fluid grace, approaching until only a few feet separated them. This close, she could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the haunted quality in his golden eyes that spoke of recent loss. Whatever brought him here ran deeper than simple necessity. "I am Alpha King Ricardo Blackwood of the Northern Territories," he announced formally. "I have a proposition that may benefit us both." His directness surprised her. Most wolves of his stature preferred elaborate verbal dancing around important matters. Isabella lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite every instinct screaming at her to submit. "I'm listening," she said simply, though her heart continued its frantic rhythm. In her current circumstances, any proposition from a powerful alpha deserved consideration, regardless of her personal reservations. Ricardo studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sensation of being evaluated like a potential weapon or asset. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. "I need a mother for my pups," he said bluntly. "And you need protection from the winter and the rogues who hunt lone omegas." His amber eyes never left her face. "The question is whether you're desperate enough to accept my terms." Chapter 6: The Proposal. The words hung in the frozen air between them like a challenge thrown down before combat. Isabella felt her world shift on its axis as she processed what Alpha King Ricardo had just suggested. Marriage, or something resembling it, to a man she'd met moments ago, caring for children she'd never seen, in exchange for survival through a winter that would otherwise claim her life. "Your terms," she managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Around them, his men maintained careful neutrality, but she could sense their attention focused on this conversation with predatory intensity. Ricardo's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in those amber depths, pain, perhaps, or vulnerability quickly suppressed. "My sons are 6 months old." Their mother died in childbirth, and they've rejected every caretaker I've provided. They need an Omega's touch, someone with natural nurturing instincts. He paused, studying her reaction before continuing. In return, you would have protection, warmth, food, and safety through the winter months. The arrangement would be practical rather than romantic. The careful way he spoke the last words suggested this distinction mattered greatly to him. Isabella's mind raced through implications and possibilities. She'd been surviving on roots and small game for weeks, watching her strength ebb as winter deepened. The alternative to accepting was likely death from cold or starvation if rogues didn't find her first. And after winter, she asked, needing to understand the full scope of what he offered. When spring comes and your children no longer need constant care? Something shifted in Ricardo's posture, a tension that suggested he hadn't considered long-term implications. We would reassess the arrangement based on its success, he said diplomatically. Translation: if she proved useful, he might keep her. If not, she'd be dismissed once her purpose was served. The practical part of her mind screamed acceptance. Survival trumped pride in their harsh world. But something deeper hesitated, recognizing the danger in becoming attached to children she might be forced to leave. I would need to see them first, she said finally. Your sons. I won't commit to caring for children I haven't met. It was a reasonable request, but also a test of his desperation. Ricardo nodded slowly, respect flickering across his features. That can be arranged. Chapter 7. Journey to Ravenclaw. The ride to Ravenclaw Castle passed in tense silence, Isabella mounted on a gentle mare Ricardo's men had provided, while he rode beside her on a massive black stallion that seemed to mirror its master's dark mood. The forest gradually gave way to cultivated lands bearing the signs of strong pack management, well-maintained borders, strategic watchtowers, and the subtle scent markers that warned away intruders. Isabella found herself stealing glances at the Alpha King, noting details that revealed more than he probably intended. His hands, strong and scarred from combat, gripped the reins with careful control. His posture remained rigidly upright despite what must be exhaustion from sleepless nights with crying infants. Everything about him spoke of a man holding himself together through sheer will. Your territory is extensive, she observed, attempting conversation as they passed through a village where pack members bowed respectfully to their alpha. The settlement showed signs of prosperity and security that most communities lacked in these troubled times. 3 generations of careful expansion, Ricardo replied without looking at her. My grandfather believed in claiming territory before enemies could take it. His tone suggested he'd inherited more than land from his predecessor, perhaps a worldview that saw threats in every shadow. They crested a hill, and Ravenclaw Castle rose before them like something from ancient legends. Massive towers reached toward gray skies, and thick walls spoke of centuries spent defending against siege. Yet despite its imposing strength, Isabella noticed how many windows remained dark, how few people moved through the courtyards below. It's magnificent, she said truthfully, though the fortress felt more like a fortress of solitude than a thriving seat of power. Something about its empty grandeur reminded her of its master, impressive, but profoundly lonely. Ricardo's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Elena loved the gardens, he said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. His jaw tightened, and the moment of vulnerability vanished behind familiar walls of control. They rode through gates that could have withstood armies, into courtyards where servants hurried about their duties with efficient silence. But underneath the castle's organized activity, Isabella's sensitive Omega hearing caught something that made her heart clench, the distant sound of infants crying with the desperate intensity of children who had learned that no comfort was coming. As they dismounted, those cries echoed off stone walls, and Isabella saw pain flash across Ricardo's features before he buried it beneath his alpha mask. Chapter 8. First Sight. Isabella followed Ricardo through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes seeming to judge her presence in these ancient halls. The crying grew louder with each step, until it became an almost physical force that made her chest ache with sympathetic response. Her omega instincts, dormant during weeks of survival-focused isolation, awakened with startling intensity. They stopped before heavy oak doors, and Ricardo's hand hesitated on the handle. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing a father dreading another failure to comfort his children. The vulnerability lasted only seconds before his mask returned, but Isabella had seen enough to understand the depth of his struggle. They may not react well to a stranger, he warned, though his tone suggested they wouldn't react well to anyone. The resignation in his voice spoke of countless disappointments, countless attempts to find someone who could reach his grieving sons. The door opened to reveal a nursery that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Painted murals depicted woodland scenes with wolves playing among trees, and sunlight streamed through tall windows. But the room's warmth was overwhelmed by the anguish of two small figures in ornate cribs, their faces red with exhaustion from hours of crying. Isabella stepped forward instinctively, drawn by impulses older than conscious thought. The twins appeared healthy despite their distress, dark hair like their father's, and even through their tears, she could see the promise of amber eyes. They were beautiful, heartbreaking, and clearly desperate for comfort no one had been able to provide. Antonio and Gabriel, Ricardo said quietly, remaining near the door as if afraid to approach his own children. They've been like this since. He couldn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. Since their mother died, leaving them with a father who feared that loving them would make him as vulnerable as their loss had already proven him to be. Without conscious decision, Isabella approached the nearest crib and began humming softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung. Antonio's crying faltered slightly, and he turned toward her voice with the instinctive hope of infants everywhere. Behind her, she heard Ricardo's sharp intake of breath as his son showed the first positive response to a stranger in months. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Hope. Isabella's soft humming filled the nursery like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Baby Antonio's cries diminished to uncertain whimpers as he studied her face with the intense curiosity of an infant encountering something new and potentially wonderful. His tiny hand reached toward her, and when she extended her finger, his grip closed around it with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice carrying the gentle warmth that came naturally to Omega mothers. "You've been having such a hard time, haven't you?" As if understanding her words, Antonio's whimpers quieted further, his amber eyes, so like his father's, focusing on her face with growing interest. Gabriel, in the neighboring crib, continued crying but with less intensity, as though his brother's calm was somehow infectious. Isabella moved carefully between the cribs, maintaining contact with Antonio while extending her free hand toward his twin. The moment her fingers brushed Gabriel's cheek, he startled into surprised silence. Behind her, Ricardo stood frozen by the door, afraid to breathe lest he break the spell that had quieted his children for the first time in months. Isabella could feel his intense gaze, could sense the barely controlled hope radiating from him like heat from a forge. She understood the weight of this moment. These few minutes of peace might determine not just her fate, but the future of this grieving family. "They're beautiful," she said softly, not turning around but knowing Ricardo needed to hear the words. "They have your eyes, but there's something else, a gentleness that must come from their mother." The mention of Elena was a risk, but Isabella sensed that pretending she had never existed would be a greater mistake. Ricardo's voice, when it came, was rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Elena used to say they would grow up to be healers rather than warriors. She saw kindness in them that I—" He stopped himself, but Isabella understood. He saw kindness in them that he feared his own broken heart couldn't nurture. Antonio gurgled softly, a sound of contentment that was clearly foreign to the nursery. Gabriel reached for Isabella's hand with growing confidence, and for the first time since their mother's death, both twins rested peacefully in the presence of another person. They remember love, Isabella murmured, as much to herself as to Ricardo. They just needed someone to remind them it still exists. Chapter 10. The Weight of Decision. As evening shadows lengthened across the nursery, Isabella found herself reluctant to leave the twins' side. They had slept peacefully for 2 hours, longer than they had managed since Elena's death, according to the relieved reports from servants who dared to whisper that perhaps, finally, their castle might know quiet again. Ricardo had watched the entire time from his position near the doorway, never fully entering the room but never leaving either. Now, as Isabella finally stepped back from the cribs, she could see the internal war playing out across his aristocratic features. Hope battled with fear, desperation with control, and underneath it all, a grief so profound it colored every other emotion. "The servants are preparing quarters for you," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral despite what they had just witnessed. "You'll have rooms adjacent to the nursery and full access to whatever you need for the children's care." Isabella nodded, though something in his tone gave her pause. "And the terms of our arrangement?" she asked, needing clarity about her position in this castle where she currently felt more like a desperately needed tool than a welcomed guest. Ricardo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You would be given the title of royal caretaker with appropriate status and protection. Your quarters, meals, clothing, all provided by the crown. In return..." He gestured toward the sleeping twins, and his voice grew softer despite himself. "In return, you give them what I cannot." The admission cost him. She could see that clearly. This was a man unaccustomed to acknowledging his limitations, especially regarding something as fundamental as caring for his own children. The vulnerability required to make such a confession spoke to the depth of his desperation. "And personal boundaries?" Isabella pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what she was accepting. "You mentioned this would be practical rather than romantic." The words felt strange on her tongue, but she needed to know where she stood. Something flickered in Ricardo's amber eyes, relief, perhaps, or disappointment so quickly suppressed she might have imagined it. "Separate quarters, separate lives," he confirmed. "You would be here for the children, nothing more." Isabella studied his face, noting the careful control that held his expression neutral. "Very well," she said finally. "I accept your proposition, Alpha King Ricardo." But even as the words left her lips, she wondered if either of them truly understood what they had just agreed to. Chapter 11. New Quarters. Isabella's assigned chambers exceeded anything she had imagined during her weeks of forest survival. The suite connected directly to the nursery through a private door, allowing instant access to the twins while maintaining the separate living arrangement Ricardo had insisted upon. Tapestries depicting peaceful meadows warmed stone walls, and a fireplace large enough to heat the entire space crackled with welcoming flames. Yet luxury felt strange after weeks of survival, and Isabella found herself examining details that revealed the room's history. Women's clothing hung in the wardrobe, garments far too fine for a servant, but perfectly sized for her frame. The writing desk bore slight impressions from previous correspondence, and dried flowers in a crystal vase suggested someone had once found joy in these chambers. These were Elena's rooms, she realized aloud, though no one was present to hear her observation. The knowledge should have disturbed her, but instead she felt a strange sense of continuity, as though the previous occupants' love for the twins still lingered in the very walls. A soft knock interrupted her exploration. "Come," she called, and a middle-aged woman entered with an armload of linens. "Begging your pardon, miss," the servant said with a respectful curtsy. "I'm Margaret, head of household staff. His Majesty instructed that you be given every comfort." Her tone held careful neutrality, but Isabella detected underlying relief. Perhaps the entire castle staff had suffered from the twins' constant distress. "Thank you, Margaret. I hope to prove worthy of such kindness." Isabella studied the woman's face, seeing wariness mixed with desperate hope. "Tell me, how have the children been since their mother's passing?" Margaret's composure cracked slightly. difficult, miss. They won't accept comfort from anyone, and His Majesty." She paused, loyalty warring with honesty. His Majesty tries, but they seem to sense his own grief, and it makes them more distressed. Through the connecting door, Isabella could hear the twins stirring from their nap, small sounds that would normally precede another crying session. Without thinking, she moved toward the nursery, driven by instincts that felt both natural and necessary. "Miss," Margaret called softly. "Perhaps I should warn you, no one has been able to calm them when they wake. They always cry for hours." But Isabella was already through the door, approaching the cribs with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose. Chapter 12. Establishing Rhythm. Dawn arrived with an unusual sound in Ravenclaw Castle: silence. For the first time in months, the twins had slept through the night without extended crying sessions that kept the entire fortress awake. Isabella woke naturally rather than to screams, finding herself disoriented by the peaceful quiet that had replaced the familiar soundtrack of infant distress. She rose quickly, concerned that such unusual silence might indicate something wrong, but found Antonio and Gabriel awake and content in their cribs, making the soft babbling sounds that healthy babies produced when unstressed. The transformation seemed miraculous, yet Isabella recognized it as the natural result of consistent, patient care from someone attuned to their needs. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered, lifting Antonio while humming the same lullaby that had first caught his attention. His response was immediate, a smile that transformed his small face and revealed the joyful child beneath months of grief and confusion. The nursery door opened as she was changing Gabriel's clothing, and Ricardo appeared in the doorway with an expression of cautious wonder. He looked as though he'd slept poorly despite the quiet night, tension evident in his posture even as relief warred with disbelief across his features. "They slept," he said simply, his voice carrying amazement as though he'd witnessed something supernatural rather than natural infant behavior. "They felt safe," Isabella replied, settling Gabriel back in his crib before turning to face the Alpha King. Children sense emotional states more acutely than adults realize. Your grief was keeping them unsettled, but now they have someone who can offer uncomplicated comfort. Ricardo stepped closer, studying his sons with new eyes. "You make it seem so simple," he said, wonder evident in his tone. "Every caretaker we hired insisted they were impossible, that something was wrong with them." Isabella lifted Antonio again, noting how he immediately relaxed against her shoulder. "Nothing was wrong with them," she said gently. "They were just babies who missed their mother and couldn't understand why no one could comfort them the way she had." The words were carefully chosen, acknowledging Elena's importance while establishing Isabella's different but equally valuable role. She watched Ricardo's face carefully, seeing the pain that still ravaged him at any mention of his lost mate, but also something new, a cautious hope that perhaps his children might heal even if he could not. "What do they need today?" he asked, surprising her with the question's implications about ongoing care and planning. Chapter 13. Watching from Shadows. Ricardo found himself drawn to the nursery throughout the day like a moth to flame, always stopping just outside the doorway where he could observe without intruding. Isabella's easy competence with his children fascinated and tormented him in equal measure. Here was everything Elena would have been, had she lived to see their sons grow. He watched Isabella feed the twins with patient skill, noting how she spoke to them constantly in soft, encouraging tones that kept them calm and engaged. When Antonio fussed over his food, she didn't force him, but instead made eating a game with gentle encouragement. Gabriel received the same attentive care, and both children responded with the kind of contentment Ricardo had thought lost forever. "She's remarkable with them," Marcus observed, joining Ricardo in his hidden observation. The beta's voice carried approval mixed with something like relief. The entire pack's stability had been threatened by their alpha's domestic struggles. "She's doing what any competent caretaker should do," Ricardo replied curtly, though his eyes never left Isabella's graceful movements around the nursery. He refused to acknowledge the deeper truth. that watching her care for his children awakened feelings he'd thought safely buried with Elena. Isabella looked up suddenly, her green eyes meeting his through the doorway with startling directness. Instead of being flustered by his observation, she smiled and gestured toward the twins. "They're asking for their father," she said simply, though both infants were quietly playing with soft toys. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Ricardo had avoided extended contact with his sons since Elena's death, afraid that his grief would upset them further. But Isabella's calm confidence suggested she believed otherwise, that perhaps the twins needed their father's presence as much as her care. "I have duties," he said automatically, the excuse feeling hollow even to his own ears. Both Isabella and Marcus remained silent, but their expressions spoke volumes about the transparent nature of his retreat. When Ricardo finally forced himself to walk away, he carried the image of Isabella's knowing look, as though she understood exactly what he was running from and why. The realization that she could read him so easily should have annoyed him, but instead it left him feeling oddly exposed and strangely relieved that someone finally saw through his carefully maintained facade. Behind him, he could hear Isabella resuming her soft conversation with the twins, her voice carrying the warmth he couldn't seem to provide his own children. Chapter 14. Unexpected Invitation. 3 days into Isabella's residence at Ravenclaw Castle, the news Ricardo had been dreading finally arrived. Beta Marcus entered his study with the grim expression that always preceded serious pack business, carrying reports that would require immediate attention and decisive action. "The Iron Fang Pack has requested a formal meeting," Marcus announced, setting sealed documents on Ricardo's desk. "Their Alpha claims to want diplomatic discussions about border disputes, but intelligence suggests they're probing for weaknesses following recent changes in your circumstances." Ricardo's jaw tightened as he scanned the formal correspondence. Alpha Damian Ironwood was known for his aggressive expansion tactics and willingness to exploit any perceived vulnerability in neighboring territories. The timing of this diplomatic overture was clearly calculated to assess whether Elena's death had compromised Ricardo's leadership capabilities. "They're testing me," Ricardo said grimly, recognizing the political maneuvering behind formal courtesy. "Damien wants to see if grief has made me weak enough to challenge." The realization filled him with cold fury. His enemies were circling like vultures, ready to tear apart everything his family had built if they sensed any opportunity. "The meeting is scheduled for 5 days hence," Marcus continued. "They'll be bringing a significant entourage, which suggests this is as much show of force as diplomatic discussion." The warning was clear. This meeting could easily become a prelude to territorial conflict if handled poorly. Ricardo stood and paced to his window, studying the courtyard below where his people went about their daily routines in blissful ignorance of the threats gathering around them. The sound of infant laughter drifted from the nursery towers, a stark reminder of what he stood to lose if his enemies succeeded in their schemes. "Double the guard rotations," he commanded. "And increase patrols along our borders. I want to know if Ironwood has positioned forces nearby." The precautions were necessary, but also revealed his own uncertainty about the coming confrontation. As Marcus turned to leave, Ricardo made an impulsive decision that surprised them both. "Include Isabella in the meeting preparations," he said. "If questions arise about pack stability, it would be advantageous to show that my household is functioning normally." The words felt like admitting weakness, but perhaps showing strength sometimes required acknowledging the sources of that strength, even when they came from unexpected quarters. Chapter 15. First Test. Isabella sensed the change in castle atmosphere immediately. Servants moved with heightened urgency, guards appeared more frequently in corridors, and an undercurrent of tension permeated every interaction. When Margaret informed her that she would be expected to attend the upcoming diplomatic meeting, Isabella realized that her role in the castle extended beyond simple childcare. "His Majesty believes your presence would demonstrate household stability," Margaret explained diplomatically, though her expression suggested the real reasons were more complex. You would be presented as royal caretaker, representing the successful continuation of castle operations despite recent changes. The euphemism for Elena's death hung heavily between them, and Isabella understood the delicate position she was being asked to occupy. She would be expected to prove that Ricardo's domestic situation was under control, that his children were properly cared for, and that his household showed no signs of the weakness his enemies hoped to exploit. "What is expected of me?" Isabella asked, recognizing that this would be her first real test within the pack hierarchy. Success or failure could determine not just her continued residence, but potentially the twins' future welfare. "Dignity, competence, and loyalty," Margaret replied simply. "The Iron Fang pack will be looking for any sign of instability they can exploit. Your behavior will be scrutinized as evidence of His Majesty's judgment and leadership capabilities." That evening, Ricardo summoned Isabella to his study, the first time they had met privately since her arrival. The room reflected its owner, impressive, carefully organized, and somehow isolated despite its obvious wealth and power. Maps covered one wall, books lined another, and everything spoke of a mind constantly engaged with strategy and planning. "You understand why your attendance is necessary?" he asked without preamble, studying her with those penetrating amber eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "To prove that your household functions normally despite personal losses," Isabella replied directly. "To demonstrate that grief hasn't compromised your practical capabilities." Ricardo nodded slowly, approval flickering across his features. "You'll be introduced as royal caretaker, a permanent member of my household staff. Answer questions simply and directly, but volunteer nothing beyond what is asked." He paused, his expression growing more intense. "Can you handle scrutiny from those who wish you ill?" Isabella met his gaze steadily. "I've survived worse than disapproving looks." For the first time since they met, Ricardo almost smiled. Chapter 16. The Iron Fang arrives. The delegation from Iron Fang Pack arrived with calculated intimidation, their black banners snapping in the winter wind as they rode through Ravenclaw's gates. Alpha Damien Ironwood led the procession, a massive man with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed Ricardo's stronghold. Behind him rode 20 warriors, enough for an honor guard, but also enough to represent a subtle threat. Isabella watched from the nursery windows as the courtyard filled with tension-charged activity. The visiting wolves moved with predatory confidence, marking territory through body language and strategic positioning. She could see Ricardo meeting them with formal courtesy that barely concealed mutual hostility, two alpha males circling each other like gladiators before combat. "Impressive turnout," Margaret murmured, joining Isabella at the window, while the twins napped peacefully in their cribs. "Alpha Ironwood rarely travels with such a large entourage unless he's making a statement." The statement was clear enough. Iron Fang Pack possessed sufficient strength to project power deep into rival territory. Isabella noted how Ironwood's men studied defensive positions and guard rotations with professional interest, gathering intelligence under the guise of diplomatic courtesy. "Will they stay long?" Isabella asked, unconsciously shifting position to better shield the cribs from the window. Her protective instincts had grown stronger since arriving at Ravenclaw, extending beyond the twins to encompass this castle that had become her sanctuary. 3 days, according to protocol, Margaret replied. Long enough for extensive negotiations and observation. The older woman's tone suggested those observations would extend far beyond formal meetings, probing for any weakness that could be exploited in future conflicts. Below, she could see Ricardo's rigid posture as he greeted his rival with the minimum courtesy required by pack law. Even from this distance, Isabella could sense the barely controlled hostility between the two men, alpha wolves forced into civilized interaction while instincts screamed for dominance challenges. That evening, Isabella would be expected to appear at the formal dinner, representing the stability of Ricardo's household while under the scrutiny of enemies seeking any advantage. The thought should have terrified her, But instead, she felt a fierce determination to protect this family that had become hers in ways she was only beginning to understand. The game was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 17. Dinner with Enemies. The great hall had been transformed for the formal dinner, its ancient stones gleaming in the light of countless candles, while tapestries bearing the Blackwood family crest created a backdrop of power and permanence. Isabella entered wearing one of Elena's modified gowns, deep blue silk that complemented her auburn hair while maintaining the dignity expected of her position as royal caretaker. She could feel the weight of hostile attention as Ironfang delegates assessed her with predatory interest. Alpha Damien Ironwood's pale eyes lingered on her face, clearly cataloging details for future use. His beta, a scarred man named Victor, studied her with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating potential weaknesses in enemy defenses. Ricardo sat at the head of the high table, his formal regalia emphasizing both his authority and the ancient legitimacy of his bloodline. When Isabella approached her designated seat, positioned to show her importance while maintaining appropriate hierarchy, he rose slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes about her status within his household. Alpha Ironwood, Ricardo said formally, "May I present Isabella Ashwood, royal caretaker, to my sons. She has proven invaluable in maintaining household stability during challenging times." The introduction was perfectly calculated, acknowledging her importance while emphasizing her service rather than any personal connection. Ironwood's smile held no warmth as he inclined his head toward Isabella. "How fortunate that suitable help appeared when most needed," he said, his tone carrying implications that made several Blackwood wolves tense visibly. One might almost call it providential timing. The subtle accusation hung in the air that Isabella's arrival was suspiciously convenient, perhaps arranged by enemies seeking to plant a spy within Ricardo's household. Isabella felt anger rise at the suggestion, but kept her expression serene as she met Ironwood's challenging stare. "Desperate circumstances often reveal unexpected solutions," she replied calmly. "Sometimes what appears fortunate is simply the result of necessity finding opportunity." Her response neither confirmed nor denied anything while subtly turning his implication back on itself. Ricardo's eyes flickered with approval at her diplomatic deflection, and Isabella felt a small surge of satisfaction at successfully navigating her first direct challenge from their enemies. The evening was just beginning, but she had drawn first blood in the verbal warfare that would determine much more than dinner conversation. Chapter 18. Verbal Warfare. As the meal progressed, Isabella found herself the target of increasingly pointed questions disguised as polite conversation. Victor, Alpha Ironwood's scarred beta, seemed particularly interested in her background and the circumstances that had brought her to Ravenclaw Castle during its time of crisis. "Tell me, Miss Ashwood," Victor said with false casualness, "what led a healer to abandon her previous life for the uncertain role of royal caretaker?" His tone suggested he expected her answer to reveal some dark secret or shameful circumstance that could be used against Ricardo. Isabella met his gaze steadily while cutting her meat with deliberate precision. "Tragedy has a way of reshaping priorities," she replied. "I found myself in need of purpose at the same time these children needed care. Sometimes the most meaningful opportunities arise from the most difficult circumstances." The answer was truthful without revealing details, acknowledging loss without admitting vulnerability. Around the table, she could see both friend and foe evaluating her response for hidden meanings or exploitable information. Alpha Ironwood leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes gleaming with predatory interest. "How remarkably convenient for all concerned," he observed. "One might wonder what other opportunities such arrangements might present for someone ambitious enough to seize them." The implication was unmistakable. He was suggesting Isabella might be positioning herself to gain power through the children, perhaps even attempting to replace Elena in more than just caretaking duties. The accusation was designed to provoke either defensive anger or guilty confirmation, both of which would serve his purposes. Instead, Isabella smiled with genuine warmth that transformed her entire demeanor. Ambition requires planning for the future, she said lightly. I find myself far too occupied with the immediate needs of two energetic infants to spare time for grand schemes. Her response drew soft laughter from several Blackwood wolves, diffusing tension while subtly emphasizing her practical focus. Ricardo's expression remained neutral, but Isabella caught the brief flash of something, respect, perhaps, or appreciation, in his amber eyes. She was holding her own against experienced political predators, protecting both herself and his household's reputation through careful words and steady nerves. The real test, however, was still to come when Ironwood inevitably shifted from probing questions to direct challenges. Chapter 19. Lines Drawn. The confrontation Isabella had been anticipating finally erupted during the final course, when Alpha Ironwood abandoned subtlety for direct challenge. His pale eyes fixed on Ricardo with undisguised hostility as he set down his wine goblet with deliberate force. These domestic arrangements are fascinating, Ironwood said, his voice carrying throughout the suddenly silent hall. One wonders, however, about the wisdom of entrusting one's heirs to unknown omegas during such vulnerable times. The word vulnerable was delivered like a weapon, designed to provoke reaction. Ricardo's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his own goblet, but his voice remained controlled when he replied. My household arrangements are my own concern, as yours are yours. I fail to see how domestic matters relate to our territorial discussions. Oh, but they relate completely, Ironwood pressed, sensing weakness. Pack leadership requires sound judgment in all matters. When an alpha's personal decisions appear impulsive, it raises questions about his capacity for larger responsibilities. The challenge was now explicit. Ironwood was questioning Ricardo's fitness to rule based on his decision to hire Isabella. Isabella felt fury rise at being used as a weapon against the man who had offered her sanctuary, but forced herself to remain silent while the alphas faced off. Are you suggesting my judgment is compromised? Ricardo asked, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that preceded violence. Around the hall, hands moved subtly toward weapons as both packs prepared for potential conflict. I'm suggesting that grief can cloud even the strongest minds, Ironwood replied with false sympathy. Perhaps your pack would benefit from guidance during these difficult times. The offer was a thinly veiled threat: submit to Ironfang influence or face the consequences of continued weakness. Isabella watched Ricardo's face, seeing the moment when political calculation warred with protective instincts. His amber eyes flickered toward her briefly, and she recognized the terrible choice he faced. Before either alpha could escalate further, Isabella spoke with calm authority that surprised everyone, including herself. Alpha Ironwood raises interesting points about judgment under pressure, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the tense silence. Perhaps he could share his own experiences with sudden loss and recovery? The question was perfectly calculated. Ironwood had lost his first mate to rival wolves 2 years earlier, a tragedy that had driven him to the aggressive expansion policies that now threatened his neighbors. By bringing up his own losses, Isabella had turned his weapon back on himself. Chapter 20. Unexpected Strength. The silence following Isabella's calculated counterattack stretched taut as a bowstring. Alpha Ironwood's face darkened with barely controlled rage at having his own tragic losses thrown back at him, while Ricardo watched with a mixture of amazement and growing respect as his mere caretaker faced down one of the territory's most dangerous predators. My personal experiences, Ironwood said through gritted teeth, hardly compare to the unique circumstances surrounding certain recent domestic arrangements. His attempt to regain control was clumsy, betraying the fury Isabella had provoked by touching his own vulnerable spots. Isabella inclined her head gracefully, acknowledging his words without retreating from her position. Of course not, she agreed smoothly. Every loss is unique, as is every path to healing. What works for one pack may be entirely inappropriate for another. Her tone was respectful but firm, giving no ground while avoiding direct confrontation. The diplomatic deflection was masterful, and Isabella could see approval flickering across the faces of Ricardo's advisors. She had managed to defend her position and Ricardo's judgment while making Ironwood appear petty for pursuing the attack further. Ricardo leaned back in his chair slightly, a subtle signal that he was no longer on the defensive. "As Miss Ashwood so wisely observes," he said, his voice carrying renewed authority, "each pack must find its own solutions to unique challenges. Perhaps we should return to discussing the territorial matters that ostensibly brought you here." The redirect was smooth and final, establishing that the domestic interrogation was over and that Isabella's presence was no longer open for debate. Ironwood's jaw worked silently as he realized he had overplayed his hand, allowing a castle servant to outmaneuver him in front of both packs. "Of course," Ironwood replied stiffly, his pale eyes promising future retribution for the humiliation he'd suffered. "Though I confess myself impressed by the quality of counsel available in the Blackwood household these days." The backhanded compliment was also a warning. Isabella had made herself a target by defending Ricardo so effectively. But as she met Ironwood's hostile gaze steadily, she felt no fear, only fierce satisfaction at protecting the family that had become hers to defend. Across the table, Ricardo's amber eyes held something new when they looked at her, respect earned through trial by fire, and perhaps something deeper that neither was ready to acknowledge. Chapter 21. Night Revelations. The diplomatic dinner concluded without further incident, but tension lingered in the castle corridors like smoke from a dying fire. Isabella retreated to the nursery after ensuring proper courtesies had been observed, finding peace in the familiar routine of checking on the sleeping twins. Antonio and Gabriel had remained undisturbed by the evening's political warfare, their innocent slumber a reminder of what truly mattered. She was humming softly while arranging their blankets when Ricardo appeared in the doorway, his formal regalia replaced by simple clothing that made him appear more human and somehow more dangerous. In the candlelight, his aristocratic features held shadows that spoke of burdens carried alone for too long. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said quietly, stepping into the nursery with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Ironwood has broken stronger opponents than you, yet you turned his own weapons against him." Isabella continued her gentle ministrations to the twins, using the activity to steady her nerves in his unexpected presence. "He underestimated me because I'm an Omega," she replied simply. "Men like him see only perceived weakness, never hidden strength." Ricardo moved closer, studying her profile in the soft light. "And what do you see when you look at me?" he asked, the question carrying weight that surprised them both with its vulnerability. The question hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous waters. Isabella finally turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting depths he was only beginning to recognize. "I see a man afraid that caring too much will cost him everything again," she said gently. "A father who loves his children so deeply he can't risk being close to them." Her perception struck him like a physical blow, exposing truths he'd hidden even from himself. "Elena died because I failed to protect her," he said, the admission torn from depths he'd thought safely sealed. "Loving someone makes you vulnerable to losses you can't survive." Isabella stepped closer, close enough that he could see the compassion in her eyes, the understanding that came from her own encounters with loss and survival. "But not loving them makes you dead while you're still breathing," she replied softly. "Your children need you, Ricardo. Not just your protection, but your heart." The use of his name without title was intimate, presumptuous, and exactly what he needed to hear. For a moment, king and subject, Alpha and Omega, man and woman stood separated by mere inches and connected by understanding that transcended all the barriers between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotions long suppressed. "I don't know how to love without fearing loss." "Neither do I," Isabella whispered. "But perhaps we could learn together." Chapter 22. The Choice. Dawn brought news that shattered the fragile peace Isabella had found at Ravenclaw Castle. Marcus burst into the nursery where she was feeding the twins, his weathered face pale with urgency and fear that made her blood turn cold before he spoke a single word. "They've taken them," he announced breathlessly. "Iron Fang wolves ambushed our border patrol during the night. 3 of our people are missing, including young Thomas and Elena's cousin Maria." His words struck the room like lightning, charging the air with desperate energy. Isabella's hands stilled on Gabriel's feeding bottle as the implications crashed over her. "Hostages," she breathed, understanding immediately why Ironwood had withdrawn so gracefully after last night's confrontation. He had never intended to win through diplomatic pressure. The dinner had been reconnaissance for this more direct assault. Ricardo appeared in the doorway like an avenging storm, his amber eyes blazing with fury and something darker. "They've demanded an exchange," he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that made Isabella's heart skip beats. "The hostages for you, Isabella. Apparently your performance last night made quite an impression." The words hit her like physical blows, though she'd known this moment was coming since she first met Ironwood's calculating gaze. She had made herself a target by defending Ricardo, and now innocent people would pay the price for her presumption. "When and where?" she asked, setting down Gabriel's bottle with hands that trembled only slightly. Around them, both Marcus and Ricardo went still, clearly expecting protests or pleas for protection that she wouldn't give. "Isabella, no," Ricardo said, stepping forward with panic breaking through his controlled facade. "I won't trade you for anyone. We'll find another way, storm their position, negotiate different terms. While they torture your people?" Isabella interrupted, rising from her chair with decision crystallizing into resolve. "While Maria suffers because I dared to challenge a predator?" She moved toward the twins' cribs, memorizing their peaceful faces. "How many lives is my safety worth, Ricardo?" The question hung between them like a sword, and Isabella could see the moment when duty as an alpha warred with feelings he'd tried to deny. His pack came first, it had to come first, but she could see the cost of that knowledge written across his aristocratic features. "There has to be another way," he said desperately, but they both knew there wasn't. Ironwood had chosen his leverage perfectly, using Ricardo's own conscience against him. Isabella reached out and touched his face gently, memorizing the texture of his skin. "Take care of them," she whispered, looking toward the twins. "Help them remember that love is worth any risk." Chapter 23: The Exchange. The meeting place Ironwood had chosen was deliberately symbolic, the ancient stone circle where pack disputes had been settled for generations, its weathered pillars bearing witness to countless oaths and betrayals. Ricardo stood among his warriors as the Iron Fang delegation approached, Isabella beside him with her chin raised in defiance of the fate she'd accepted. She had spent the morning with the twins, memorizing their faces and voices, whispering promises she might not live to keep. Antonio and Gabriel had sensed something wrong, clinging to her with unusual insistence, as though their infant instincts recognized the approaching separation. "Remember what I taught you about strength," she had whispered to Ricardo during their final private moment. "Love doesn't make you weak, it makes you fight harder for what matters." Her words were meant as comfort, but they felt like goodbye. Now, watching Ironwood approach with his captive stumbling behind him, Ricardo fought every instinct that screamed at him to protect the woman who had become essential to his world. 3 of his people, Thomas barely 18, Maria with her gentle healer's hands, and Marcus's nephew Daniel, bore signs of rough treatment, but appeared unharmed. "A fair exchange," Ironwood called across the circle, his pale eyes glittering with triumph. 1 Omega for 3 loyal pack members. Surely even the soft-hearted Blackwood Alpha can see the mathematics of such generosity. Isabella stepped forward before Ricardo could speak, her voice carrying clearly across the ancient stones. "I am Isabella Ashwood, and I come willingly to honor the agreement." Her formal declaration made the exchange legally binding under pack law, preventing Ricardo from later claiming coercion. "Isabella," Ricardo said, her name torn from his throat like a physical wound. Everything in him rebelled against letting her walk into Ironwood's hands, but duty and pack law bound him as surely as chains. This isn't over. She turned back once, her green eyes meeting his with infinite tenderness. Take care of our children, she said softly, the possessive pronoun hanging between them like a confession. And remember that some things are worth any sacrifice. As she walked toward Ironwood's warriors, Ricardo felt his heart breaking in ways that made Elena's death seem merciful by comparison. This time, he was choosing to let love slip away, and the knowledge nearly drove him to his knees. The ancient stones watched in silence as Isabella disappeared into captivity, carrying with her all of Ricardo's newfound hope for healing. Chapter 24. The Rescue and Return. Ricardo's war council lasted exactly 30 minutes before he dismissed every cautious voice urging patience and political solutions. Ironwood had made a critical error in targeting Isabella. He'd given Ricardo something worth risking everything to protect, awakening the part of him that Elena's death had frozen. We strike tonight, he announced, his amber eyes blazing with determination that transformed him from grieving widower to warrior king. Ironwood expects us to negotiate or plan elaborate sieges. He won't anticipate immediate action. Marcus tried once more to counsel patience. Sire, intelligence suggests they're holding her in the old fortress ruins. It's defensible terrain, and we'll be outnumbered. Then we don't fight fair, Ricardo cut him off. We fight smart, and we fight like wolves protecting our pack. The possessive intensity in his voice left no doubt that Isabella had become his to protect. Consequences be damned. The assault came with the hunter's moon, Ricardo leading a small strike force through terrain he'd known since childhood. They moved like ghosts through Ironfang territory, avoiding patrols and using stealth where Ironwood expected confrontation. When they finally struck the ruins where Isabella was held, it was with the fury of wolves protecting their mate. Isabella heard the sounds of battle and felt her heart soar with desperate hope. Through the narrow window of her stone prison, she could see figures moving with lethal grace through Ironwood's scattered guards. When the door burst open and Ricardo appeared like an avenging angel, she felt something break free in her chest. I told you this wasn't over, he said, pulling her against him with desperate intensity. Did you really think I'd let him keep you? The children, she began, but he silenced her with a kiss that spoke of fear conquered and love finally acknowledged. Are safe and asking for their mother, he whispered against her lips. Because that's what you are, Isabella. What you've always been since the moment you chose to stay. The ride back to Ravenclaw Castle passed in a blur of shared relief and whispered confessions. As they approached the familiar towers, Isabella could hear something that made her heart sing, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the nursery windows. Welcome home, Ricardo said, lifting her down from her horse with hands that trembled slightly with residual fear and overwhelming relief. Isabella looked up at the castle that had become her sanctuary, then at the man who had become her heart. Home, she agreed, understanding finally that some battles were worth any risk, and some loves were strong enough to overcome any fear. In the nursery above, Antonio and Gabriel waited for their parents' return, their happy babbling a promise that love, once found, would never again be abandoned to pride or fear.